Great. Welcome, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us this evening for Shana Cutaia, who is our Director of Student Services and will be presenting for us this evening on the Dignity for All Students Act, which I think is a nice timely topic for this evening to get us all thinking a little bit more about that.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm also very much aware it's Western New York and it's Monday Night Football and the Bills are playing. So I didn't know this many people would actually show up. I really appreciate it. As Lori said, I'm the Director of Student Services since July 1st. So new to this role, but I was the principal at Barker Road Middle School prior to that for 7 years. And then for a little under 5 years was the assistant principal in Brighton at 12 Corners Middle School. So I have been working with the Dignity Act through all of those different roles. So as the Director of Student Services, I'm also the Dignity Act coordinator for the district. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that means as we get going here. And I will share my screen so that you don't have to just stare at me. So I'll talk a little bit about what that means. And we also, as we were all kind of preparing for this evening, recognize that there have been several presentations over the years, including one that I feel was really thorough. So we'll make sure that we make those really more available so that if someone does click on the Dignity for All Students Act on the website, that they'll be able to get those resources. So hopefully this one that might be a little more brief and we'll save more time tonight for questions. And then the other one that gets into some more details as well. So hopefully between the two, we'll have answers on the basis, whether it's keep those updated and fresh so that there's some resources for people to be able to access on our website. So I will go into kind of a high level overview of what the Dignity Act is, what it says and what it means for us in our schools, both from the parent lens and from the school administrator lens, and of course, most importantly for our students and what we do for our kids as they're working through situations in school together. So the Dignity Act is a law, and this is a New York State law that's really against bullying and discrimination, and then it was updated to include cyberbullying as well, almost 10 years ago now. And it includes, but isn't limited to discrimination that we might think of. And we talk about these categories or groups as protected categories. So those are some of the things as we're discussing incidents that happen. We discuss whether it involves a protected category. So those are part of the things that we use to determine whether something gets qualified as a DASA incident, a Dignity for All Students Act incident. So is it something that someone was discriminated based on one of their protected categories? So their race, their sexual orientation, their religion, gender, any of those different areas. And that kind of helps us to decide what category it will fall into. And the law is pretty specific, and we have a pretty extensive and detailed way to capture all of the incidents that happen. And so all of our schools use the same reporting spreadsheet mechanism that's kind of developed over the last 5 years or so based on some of our more tech savvy administrators. And so we capture all of those different incidents, whether or not they're reported to the state as a DASA incident. So it could be a series of incidents that happen in terms of how the DASA Act defines harassment. But one of the important things that we've learned through our trainings and through how we've trained our students under DASA is that, especially with cyberbullying, even one incident could become an incident of bullying, because it really then is that person who is being harassed, they could go back to that one single incident, that one single post countless times. Whereas before social media became a part of our lives, if one thing happened, it would have probably been a single incident, wouldn't necessarily rise to the case of bullying. But again, with social media, once something's posted, someone can take a screenshot of that, or they themselves can go back and look at it many, many times and be re-traumatized, re-harassed by that situation, or every time someone likes it or adds a comment to it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a series of incidents. It could be a single incident. And we really look at how did the incident that happened interfere with the educational environment, with that student's ability to be able to focus in school, with their well-being, or would cause a student to feel fearful or be worried for their physical safety. So there's the emotional, social impact, and also the physical fear. So you can get a lot of information in our board policy. If you look online, you can actually click right into policy 7552, and that actually has all of these different definitions in much more detail. And it will talk about the actual policy behind really important work like the prevention, the intervention, those tier 1 type strategies, we call them. How are we instructing students? How are we creating that warm and welcoming environment? And then it'll go through the process of the different reporting mechanisms that we have. So I'll talk you through a little bit of those tonight as well. And then it also talks about the code of conduct, which is really important. So all of the work that we've been doing around DASA really is woven through the code of conduct work that's happening right now. We are updating the third phase of the code of conduct, and that really looks at specific incidents, the levels of behavior, and what types of responses are appropriate to that, both in the form of a discipline response and in the form of a restorative approach and the healing that happens after an incident. And then all of these things really, again, circle back to the equity goals that we've created. And if you're familiar with the culturally responsive sustaining education framework through New York State, that really frames the equity lens that we should be looking at from a curricular view and from that environment and from our professional development. All of these things are really woven together. And DASA was kind of the first piece of that guides us through as we come upon these different incidents. There's some confidentiality pieces, which I'll talk to you about as well on both sides. So confidentiality for someone who's reporting something, and there's some nuances to that, and then confidentiality on the other side of it, and what families or even staff members can find out about a certain situation and about students that might be involved. And then we have ways, of course, that there's training involved. So I'll share in a moment, there's a Dignity Act coordinator in each building. So every building has an administrator that serves as the Dignity Act coordinator. They have to go through a separate training. So anyone in New York State who is a teacher has to be involved in the DASA initial training. And then there's a more extensive multi-day training that Dignity Act coordinators for each building have to be a part of. And then we get together. So for instance, this week, actually, I'm pulling together all of the Dignity Act coordinators. We'll do some tabletop drills, try and get some of that inter-rater reliability where we look at an incident and say, what would you do? How would you respond? What are some restorative approaches you might take to be able to just get some more consistency and some opportunities to be able to use each other as resources as well. So we'll look at that together, and we'll look at kind of the organizational flow chart that we have for how we respond to different incidents and be able to update any of those processes from what we've learned over the past year. So in terms of confidentiality, it's important to know that if a student, if you've ever completed the actual reporting form, you can choose to stay anonymous, but that's not something that can always be guaranteed. So we do our best to be able to protect our students. And I think almost all of the time we can do that, and we can not share the names of people who are sharing that information. However, if you get into a situation where, say, a suspension is involved, there are some legal rights that accused student and their family has. And one of those is the ability to be able to question witnesses. So we work through that in different ways, where the administrator typically serves as the witness who speaks on behalf of a student who's spoken to them, but it's not something that we could guarantee if we were really pushed on that piece. But almost all of the time, we can help keep those students confidential. And they have the right to do that right within that form, where students and family members and community members can report potential DASA violations to us. And then also, as they even just go and speak to an administrator or call on the phone, they have the ability to request to remain anonymous. What we know we can't change is or share is anything under FERPA. So under that Education Rights Privacy Act, we can't share info if someone's reporting something, if they have questions about what that student's disciplinary record was, or what the results of their discipline would be, any consequences that they might receive in school. We can't share that piece with any other parent, because that's part of their educational record. However, it's really important to know that if you report something, you should have some follow-up. So every once in a while, as a principal, you would get this anonymous note in your mailbox and it's not signed, and there's nothing there to be able to follow up with. And that can be really hard, because you really want to be able to circle back to somebody. So if you use that online reporting mechanism, you can put in your name and information, and then also put that you'd like to remain anonymous. And what that does is it allows that administrator to come back to you, maybe to ask some questions, but also to be able to follow up and let you know, yes, we were able to handle that situation. Yes, we know that this situation is now safe. It is a really important part of the process, that even though you might not know that child got after school detention for 3 days or whatever that specific piece is, you always should be receiving some type of follow-up if you're giving that information to administrators when you're sharing. And then even among staff, it can be hard within a school, but we really try to not have staff talking about different situations other than with the people who are going to help them. So we really keep those pieces confidential. It should really just be on a need to know basis. And sometimes that might look like, well, these two students had some type of altercation, or there was an incident where one might feel unsafe. And so if we look through their schedule and see that they have health class together, we'd want to make sure that we let the health teacher know that something had happened, and that they want to be cautious in having those two students together, perhaps, and just to have an awareness level. So other than that, we really try to, unless there's something that the staff need to know in order to keep a student safe, or we need to be looking out for something, we want to try and keep those things as confidential as possible.
And Shana, there's a question in the chat. Does the form have to be completed by a parent, or could a student submit on their own?
No, it could be a parent, it could be a student, it could be a staff member. Sometimes I'll have administrators go in and put in the form, just because then it triggers part of our process. So it absolutely could be, and sometimes is a student. Absolutely. Yeah. Good question. So in terms of the investigation process, once that form is triggered, and I say the form because that's there and it's an important piece of the documentation, but you also don't need to complete a form in order for an incident to be recognized. So if someone's a teacher, a paraprofessional, the school nurse is walking down the hall and they see something or they hear something, first they should be addressing that right away. And they must report that to an administrator within 1 day. So we are mandated to report those incidents that we come upon. So whether or not a parent or a student even knows that it's happening, those things should be reported. And so it might be a lunchroom monitor who's reporting something right to the assistant principal, and that person will go through and they will input it into the system that we use, and then they'll go ahead and start their investigation. And what we really try and do, I know sometimes we're working with families and they'll say, well, there were 10 students around, just talk to all 10 students. And sometimes we need to do that, and sometimes we don't. So if we talk to the accuser and the person who's being accused and their stories are the same, and a student says, yes, I did say that, and whether or not I meant to or not, we get to the bottom of that piece. But if we can end the investigation there and get those stories and really listen to those students and document that well, that can really be good in those situations, to not have to widen it to more and more students, because then we tend to just make it more and more of a disruption. And so once we kind of can get to the bottom of something and keep that investigation as small and close as possible, it's really better for both students in the situation. Now, many times they don't agree or they have some differences, and we need to figure out from both sides who may have been around that might be more impartial that can come in. And sometimes we do have to speak to all the students who are there, or if there's video footage either from a school bus or in the hallway, that we look at all of those different pieces. And of course, we always separate students when we're interviewing them, because it's just a better way to get clean information. But again, as I said, when you bring up a situation, the administrator that you speak with or that you're working with, or that calls you after you've sent the form in, should be following up with you and letting you know what that process was, that they did speak to other students. Now, they won't tell you who those students are, but they should be able to say, yes, we saw this happen on the bus. We spoke to the 2 kids who were in the seat next door. We looked at the footage and we found out that either, yes, we can confirm, or we found slightly different information, which they may or may not be able to share. But one of the important things that we do is really document all of those pieces. So document any of the emails that have gone back and forth, or conversations that need to be had with different staff members or students. The administrator has a pretty detailed form to be able to document all of those different pieces.
We have one other question that's related to that. And then there's another one that you may be getting to, so I'm holding on that. But following the other question, thinking about students who may not want parents to know their sexual orientation or gender, could parents be completely not included in this process if they're being harassed, if they don't know about this, or would that be then brought back to the parents?
So we would want to handle all those situations in a very sensitive manner. I can tell you, when students are meeting with an administrator, parents should be notified. So even if I was, as a school principal, bringing in someone as a witness, even if they did absolutely nothing wrong and we just had a 30-second conversation, I would always call the parent and just say, I just want you to know your child spoke to me. This is why. They didn't do anything wrong. So we would want to share, certainly if a child is being harassed in school, it's really important that their parent knows that's happening, because they should be looking for other things outside of school as well. And we want to bring support. I think in speaking with that student, and remember, part of that restorative approach is bringing in other people. So whether it's the school counselor, the social worker, the school psychologist who really has a connection with that child, we would want to make sure that we're not sharing something that could be potentially harmful for the child. But we want to make sure that we're being open with parents. So if a child was being harassed, we would be sharing that with their parents.
Shana, can I just ask something? Sorry, it's Rabina. I guess where I'm trying to think about, it's nice, it's good to see you. This is very helpful, is I'm thinking about, we know incidences where a kid may not be out with their parents, but maybe at school. And then if they're being harassed because they're trans, etc., or gender identity, they probably, we don't want them to be harassed, but it would almost be worse for them in some situations if the parents weren't kind of brought into it. So is there a gray zone, I guess, is what I'm trying to figure out to help those students?
There's always a gray zone in all of these situations.
Okay.
It's hard to just have a black and white. I remember as a early on new assistant principal, I said, is there a chart somewhere that just says when a child does this, this is their consequence? Because that would really help. They're never quite black and white. I think in those situations, we would want to be more general if we could. And it really depends. If we feel that a child were going to be in danger in some way, or the child had shared something with us that we felt that would be a danger to them to share something with their parents, then we would support them in a different way. So we would be looking at different mandated reports that we would make to make sure that child was safe at home and at school. But we certainly, if we felt like a child were in harm or were being harassed, we would want to be able to work with the parents on that. I can say when we're working on these, it's never in isolation. So you never just have a principal meet with a student to make a quick decision, especially when it's something that's DASA related. And so the counselor is almost always involved, or the school psychologist or the social worker, or whoever has a relationship with that child or could have a relationship with that child, because even sometimes when you're dealing with sensitive situations, to be interviewed just by an administrator that you may not have a relationship with, we like to have someone else there as well. So sometimes it takes a long time. We might have a student for several periods or half the day as we're working through them on something that might be happening. So I know that's not really a very clear answer, but we wouldn't share something with a parent that we felt like would be harmful. I can't think of a situation where that happened with an incident like this, where a child were being harassed, but certainly we get some information about students that they would prefer us not to share with their parents. And sometimes we feel like it's really necessary for us to do that for that child's safety. But if it's not, then we wouldn't do that. So here are, these are listed on our website under the Dignity Act section. So you'll see at the elementary level, it's the building principal. And then if there's an assistant principal in the building, then it's typically one of the assistant principals who acts as the Dignity Act coordinator. And they are actually listed on posters, look very similar to the one there on the screen. And they're listed around the school. And again, they're on the website, but it doesn't mean that you have to find this person. So your math teacher, the study hall attendant, someone who's on a school bus, anybody, the school principal, even if it's the assistant principal who's the Dignity Act coordinator, they're all working together. And again, everybody within the school is mandated to report any even potential DASA situations to the administration within a day. And qualify as DASA. Some things may not, but regardless, we need to follow up on them. And so it's not up to that person to decide whether it's something that would be reported as a DASA incident. They just know that they need to be reporting those so they can be followed up with. So these are the people that get that specialized training that really house those. We have these pretty lengthy shared documents that help us at the end of the year when we go to make our report to the state. Really helps us to say, it has a lot of the investigative information right within there, has any protected categories of the person who was accused and the person who is accusing. So all of those pieces are kept right in there, regardless of whether or not something ends up actually falling into the DASA category in terms of reporting. So our responsibilities are to share the process and to make sure that people are aware of the process. So if like this, having things on our website for families to be able to access. Again, I think posting videos like this right there on the website is really helpful, because a lot of times this doesn't become important to someone until it's important to you, and until your child may be struggling with something. And so having any of that information there, I think is really helpful in making it clear and current. And then listening to our students, listening to our families, taking all reports seriously. I would say one of the things that has really come up and been impactful for me, having sat with a lot of families and students in really emotional, sad, hard conversations, is that our opportunity to build trust and to build a safe environment for students and their families come in moments like these. So really sitting back and listening and trying to understand and following up is probably the most important thing. So even if something we say it probably isn't going to qualify as DASA, that really becomes such a secondary piece. It's more important, how are we going to help this child? How are we going to help this family? How do we make the environment more safe? What supports can we put in place? And making sure that that follow-up is there, and making sure that we're letting our children, our students, know when something occurs that it's not acceptable. And that's not just to the student who's accused, but also to the student who's been harmed, that what happened to them is not acceptable, and that we're going to follow up on it, and then actually following up with them and making sure that they're okay, and making sure that their families are aware of what's happening as well.
Shana, there's a question that I was waiting for, and I know Lori was as well, because I knew the slide was coming up. But for the DASA reports, who decides which DASA reports are reported to the state, and how do they decide? So that's part one. And then part two, and you may not know the answer to this right now, but what % of the DASA reports does the district report to the actual state?
I don't know the percentage of the number of reports, because really any behavioral incident could potentially fall, could be something that we would consider. But the process for determining really involves more people than just that one DASA coordinator. So when an event comes through, what happens when someone clicks that button on the website, I receive the report, and the Dignity Act coordinator for the building receives the report, and then I will reach out to the building and say, do you need any assistance with this? Depending on what the situation it is it might be something that's more clear cut that they handle on a more regular basis. If it's something that's much more sensitive or involved, then we might go over to the building and have more of a conversation. They'll involve the superintendent, especially if it's more of a long-term suspension or something that's highly sensitive. Really, if there's a situation where a student has been made to feel threatened or harmed because of one of those protected categories, it will fall under DASA. So there's not a ton of conversation that needs to go into whether or not something qualifies, unless we just can't get to the bottom of whether something happened. And sometimes that happens, but kids, especially, I would say, having worked with a lot of students in our district, they'll pretty much own what they did or own part of it, or we can figure out for the most part what's happened in different situations. So I would have to look into what percentage of things actually get reported, but I would say things are reported from most buildings, certainly, definitely all the secondary buildings every year that fall under DASA. And we don't really look at it as a negative of not wanting to report something. We just really want it to be accurate. And so we'll look through all of those. I know as a principal, my assistant principal would sit down with me. We would look through all the incidents. And if they would ask me, it's really more the form that we complete to do the reporting is very lengthy. And it's more about the many categories that something could fall into. So whether it involved a weapon or a certain category, or was it physical, or was it online? And sometimes things cross multiple categories. So it's those types of things we're typically trying to figure out when we go to do the reporting, is which category does it fall best into when we're doing those reports. And so as the district coordinator, now I look at all of the buildings, they do their report, and then we go in and we look for those trends and we look for themes, and we say, why, in these two buildings, are we seeing more of this? Or at this age group, we're seeing more of this, and what types of things what we need to do to be able to respond on a more global level that maybe the buildings themselves might not be able to see. That's a good question. So we talked about that school personnel are obligated to report, administrators are obligated to respond. They go through the investigation process, and that kind of lengthy shared document is completed along the way. Our assistant principals, I would say, especially at the secondary level, are very good at keeping very detailed notes and reports of their investigations. And then really, as I said, that the most important thing is not really whether or not something qualified, but how are we responding to do the best we can for the child or the family that reported this, and also the child or family on the other end of it, because we really want to make these situations educational. So we want to make sure that we're not just delivering a consequence and moving on. We've really been taking a much more restorative approach. And so there's a discipline piece of it. And this is really, as we're reframing our code of conduct, which we're hoping we'll be able to finish and have to the board in December or January, this third phase really looks at this piece. So what are the actual disciplinary responses that are taken? And so those all have different legalities to them and things that we follow. But then also, how are we using those in a restorative way? So sometimes people hear about restorative practices and they think, oh, there's not going to be any discipline anymore. And that's not the case. But while a child is suspended, what are we doing with that time instead of just putting them in a room in school or sending them home? So that would be, let's say a child is engaged in vaping or something like that. So we use the time that they're suspended to be able to have them work through the choices program. So they receive some education right there while they're within the suspension time frame. How can we create healing situations for families where we're able to get the students together? I would say 10 years ago, we said, don't put the students together. And now really the research has shown us that bringing students together and allowing them to work through some of those pieces in a safe, restorative situation with people who are trained to have those conversations really is helping them to be able to heal and lessens their anxiety about getting back into the typical school environment. So some of the things around the actual disciplinary pieces that deal less with DASA, more code of conduct, are some of those actual consequences that students receive. And so we're laying those out within the code of conduct so we can share what they look like, how they happen, but also how we can use those in a more restorative. We certainly, if there's a DASA violation, that is one of the more likely consequences, although there are all sorts of things that play into that. Students' dispositions, their special needs, their things that they may or may not be educated on going into those situations. So we look at principal can only suspend a student 5 days. And then we go to, if they recommend, or if the superintendent potentially recommends that a student be suspended out of school for more than 5 days, then we go to what's called a superintendent hearing. So that's where you have an impartial person come in, and they really run a due process where both sides get to share. So one side would be the district, the other side would be the family. And the student gets to share whether or not they did whatever happened. And then we take lots of different things into consideration in then making a recommendation to potentially be suspended for longer than that. Again, the important thing within that is then using that time to be restorative. The hope would be that we're doing education and supporting all of our students, even students who've made mistakes and made very poor choices, even when they've harmed others. We want to be able to still support that student to get them back into the educational environment when we can, and do it in a way that's going to be healthy for everybody involved. And I think we've done a lot more, especially over the past couple of years, with that restorative piece in terms of addressing harm for students who have been harmed in a situation. And we've learned that sometimes it's far beyond sometimes the person themselves who were who was the one who was the target of something. There could be other people around them who are even more harmed than that person. So it really just depends on the student themselves. And we try to really bring in students for whether it's counseling or additional supports that we can offer within the school with school social workers, clinicians through University of Rochester. So any different supports that we have to offer to students, as well as the environment. So sometimes we need to go into an entire classroom and have a restorative circle because something happened that was harmful within that setting. And we don't want the setting to start up again without addressing that harm. So it really depends on the situation and how many students and teachers or staff members were impacted. So I just listed some ongoing pieces here because DASA really has tentacles into a lot of the work that we're doing, and we could spend a lot of time talking about. We could do a whole nother evening on all different things that we're doing. We could list a lot of things that are happening in different places, but listing things and having people come in and talk to our kids or providing additional supports, that kind of runs alongside this work. So we won't be done with our work with creating this warm and welcoming environment potentially ever. We work with children. Children will make mistakes. Children come from sometimes traumatic incidents or environments, and they're going to make some mistakes as they grow and develop. And so we know we'll always need to use a process like this to be able to work through those different things. But there are a few things that help us along the way with that. So you've probably seen the equity policy that was approved by the board in the spring that kind of created the foundation for a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last few years. And when you look at the equity policy, and if you kind of crosswalk those documents of that, the CRSE framework from New York State, along with our code of conduct and the goals that the district has around equity, they really create more of a layered approach, which is what we'll always need to do. You're never going to be able to have one assembly, one speaker come in, do one thing or purchase a program to be able to use that's going to create that environment where we don't have bullying and harassment. It's something we're always going to have to work at and change and adapt because our students are always changing and adapting. So some of the things we've been working on over the past couple years, the relationship mapping is really important. In some schools, they call it the DOT project. That's where you have students going in and really quickly defining whether or not they have someone within the school, an adult that they feel that they would go to in a situation where they were at harm or they were really worried, concerned, anxious, depressed about something. Do they have someone they would go to? And then we do the reverse relationship mapping where we ask the same of staff. And almost all the time, staff are shocked by the students who chose them and vice versa. And so that's really caused us to be able to take a different approach and say, so all of these students didn't have someone that they said that they connected with. So how can we respond to that and create some more connections for that student? Or this teacher has a lot of kids they're connecting with. What are they doing that we might be able to learn from? This year, every other year, we do the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And so that will actually happen in the fall next week, I believe, or the week after, right, that week before Halloween. And so that really looks at a lot of different risk factors. That'll be asking our students questions around bullying and harassment around all of these different protected categories, sexual orientation, gender identity, race, religion, but it also brings in the piece of the drug and alcohol use and other behaviors. This year, there's COVID questions in there about how students were handling COVID, and then there's a lot of social and emotional health questions in there as well. So that's just some data pieces for us to be able to use more in a tier 1 preventative approach. And then we're really trying to look at different feedback loops after we've had incidents, especially incidents where I think every incident we learn from. I can tell you as a building principal, there were many times I thought, oh, I wish I had handled this differently at the beginning. And we learn from those things. So really just giving opportunities for our Dignity Act coordinators and our school community to get together and bringing in students. So bringing in student voice around different responses and how they felt maybe we did or did not handle it well, and what we can learn from it and learn from them are really things that that have been helpful to us and that we know we need to do more of as well. And I think that
Great. We do have a couple of questions from the chat that I'd love to start with, just because those have been the ones that have been sitting there for a little bit longer. How often, Janet asked this question, how often do staff receive a refresher training on DASA? And what percentage, I guess, of those of the DASA reports are made by staff and teachers?
a lot of reports are made by staff and teachers. So because they're the ones who hear most of the things, especially in the hallway. So we have to really work to encourage students to come forward, although they do more and more now. But there are refreshers every year. So each year, the assistant principals, I guess, depending on which building, for instance, with the principal, assistant principals, sometimes with counselors, they do a training for students and staff on really the code of conduct and how we follow up on situations. And then they highlight ways and who they should go to when they have a situation. So they might not say, this is the Dignity for All Students Act. And in some schools they do, they do really highlight that act and that law. But they, in some schools, developmentally, it just depends on how they share that. They'll do it in a way that might make most sense for that level. So make sure you go to a trusted adult and let them know if something's happening. So I'm not sure the percentage that are brought forward by adults in the school, but quite a few. And they come in a different form of behavioral referrals, if you've heard that term. So there's literally a form that teachers use when this child said this in class to this other student, or I don't even know who these two kids are, but I found them in the hallway and this child was saying this, or this is what I observed happening. And they'll just write out specifically what happened, and those go right into our system as well.
Great, thanks. And I also had another question too, is when you get the YRBS data, like when that gets aggregated and analyzed, and then at what point then the community starts hearing, like with the sharing out of what the results might be? Would that be sometime in the spring or the winter? Or?
So typically the survey is given in the spring every other year. So this year's a bit of an anomaly because it was postponed last year due to COVID. So we wanted to keep it within the same, the county decided, all of the different groups that work together, that we wanted it in the same calendar year so that we could still do that comparative analysis between the cohorts, because we have many years of data to be able to compare. So that will be given out, and it's given through SurveyMonkey. So we work with our data team, and we will get the data almost immediately. I work with Dr. Jeff Kimmer and his team. They've been working with us the whole way through. Once we've looked at the questions that we want to ask, we can add our own questions if we want to. And then they will give us that data to be able to look at really that next week. So these should be finished, this round should be finished in early November, and I'll be reporting out to the Board of Education as soon as potentially by the December meeting or the January meeting for our data. We will get a comparative analysis from Monroe County where we can compare to all of the other districts, and that won't come until March. So part of the issue, I'd be interested to see how it works this year, is in the spring, once you get that information, by the time we get the comparative analysis and share it, the kids are gone from the year that they were. We still know who the kids were, but they've moved on, so we can follow the cohort. But this year we will actually be able to say in December or January, this is what our children who are right here, the 9th graders right in our class, are saying. You know, this percentage of them have felt depressed or anxious when coming to school, or have, you know, harmed themselves in some way. And so we'll have that information right about the students that are in front of us. So that should be interesting. It'll be interesting to see if we end up going back to a spring to be able to give the survey, or if we end up liking it in the fall.
I ask a follow-up question to that, even though we're detouring from DASA. I think it was this survey, when the results were reported out last time, the response rate from the high schoolers was quite small as compared to the middle school. I think, unless I'm thinking of one of the other surveys, am I?
I think you're thinking of the culture survey,
Okay.
The federal survey on culture and climate. The youth risk behavior survey goes to all students.
Okay.
So they will give that, I think they do it in phys ed classes at both middle and high school. So it's our 6th through 12th graders. And unless they missed school that day, it should go to all of the students, or almost all of the students. But yes.
Thanks.
I remember that survey too.
Okay, we've got more questions. Okay, so there was also a follow-up question about how often students were told about the DASA process, and do they know where they can complete a form? How often are they let know about that?
So each year, the school has some type of, it's different at each level. So there are grade level assemblies at some levels, and there are whole school assemblies at some level. There are morning announcements. So there's different ways that they are told. It's typically in the fall, and then sometimes we do what we call a booster shot in January as well, or after February break, and sometimes we need a little booster shot reminder. And I don't know that we often talk about, and maybe some schools are that specific about the form. With the students, we really talk more about where they can go within the school and who they should be sharing things with within the school, which is really any trusted adult. So they tend to think of the administrators as the person who handles discipline, but they also might be talking to their school counselor, might be talking to their favorite teacher, paraprofessional, bus driver. And really, they should be reporting to anything. And our students really do a nice job of reporting on behalf of each other. So sometimes that's what ends up happening. So a student might be talking about something else that they saw or heard happen to a friend or to someone else in the hallway.
Sorry, I was muted. There was a related question on that, and then I'll come back to another one. But there are a lot of students reporting that they've experienced incidences surrounding protected categories, racism, and that they felt that that was dismissed and that it was swept under the rug. The assumption that if parents weren't notified, the staff who was told didn't complete a DASA form. How are situations like that going to be prevented in the future?
Mm-hmm. I think that's been probably one of the most eye-opening and really just painful to hear, with the situations that have been happening recently in the district. Our students have spoken to us quite a bit. So I've been to both high schools in particular and met with groups of students, and it is very hard to hear students say, I brought something forward, or even worse, I know if I were to bring something forward, nothing would happen, is painful beyond words. When I look at my colleagues, and I know when they are hearing of these incidents that things are happening and that they're following up. But it's really giving us a lot of feedback on how we deal with and support that student who's bringing something to us. That's why at the beginning I was saying it's probably the most important thing that we do is looping back around with that student, because it is an incredibly fast pace, right? Especially in our secondary schools, you might be dealing with something, you're calling the parents, you're figuring the things out, you're writing the letters and suspension things and all these other things you have to do. And we really need to slow down our process and make sure that we are getting back together with those students who made that complaint or shared with us something to follow up on. And students were even able to give us situations where they came into an office and they might have shared with the clerical worker something that was going on, and they did feel dismissed. And so I think those are really important things for us to hear, and that should never ever be the case. So when a student shares something, what I learned from meeting with students most recently is, well, what we know is when a student comes to share something with us, it could be the 20th time that something's happened to them. Just like if you catch a student with a vape, that's probably not the first day that happened, right? It's probably been happening for a long time. So it's really even more important that they may have, suffered through or been harmed 10, 15, 20 times by something. And that one time that they come to tell you something, that's when it's really important to sit down and listen and make sure that you're following through and following up, because that's our opportunity to build trust with that student so that they'll share things with us in the future, because that's when we get to a situation where it really does impact our culture and climate, because things are happening and we're not hearing about them. And I would say the same thing for teachers. Our kids are absolutely phenomenal. They're not doing things right in front of teachers. They're typically not happening right in the middle of class or when they're walking by a teacher in the hallway. It's in more covert ways, quieter ways, online, things that there's not an adult right there, because we have, respectful, great students in our district. And so I think we really just have to really pay extra attention when things are being reported. And, it's not up to students to tell a teacher, and then if they feel like they didn't do something, then of course they would say you should tell your parents and they should let the administrator know, but it's not up to the students to do that. It's up to us to make sure that we train our staff to be able to report those things in a timely manner. So those reminders are there, and those happen regularly with our staff. But yeah, I would say those are amongst the most painful conversations we've had. I've been a part of over the past month, is students very genuinely feeling that people wouldn't care if something like that happened to them.
I think another related question is, how can confidentiality be better fostered? Today's social media world has people posting pictures, names, and addresses of students involved in incidences.
It's very challenging. And even though we'll say we can't tell what a disciplinary consequence was, or if I'm talking to a parent and I say, well, we can't tell you the name of the other student involved. Well, it used to be, well, they would know because their child would come home and the child would tell them. But now, it can really get out quite a bit. And that's for all of our students, even for students who have made mistakes and caused harm, and then, are harassed in their own way, right, by others online who are using their name and sharing things about them. And these are all our kids, and we want to help them all through these situations. And it definitely hurts on all sides. I can tell you that, having sat through a lot of these situations. And I think that's a really good question. How can we do that? We can, we train our students from a very young age. I think we start in about 4th grade, talking about social media, talking about how to use it responsibly, and what happens when you don't use it responsibly. What happens as soon as something leaves your phone and you lose complete control over, you just sent it to that one, your best friend or your boyfriend, or and you thought it was safe to send it to that one person, and then everyone on the team has it, or something like that. And so we can continue with those trainings, and just being really explicit about those things. And I think we need to do the same with us as adults, because I know how it is. I have children myself. It's exhausting to try and follow around what your children are doing on the iPads and on phones, and anything we can do to help support each other too, to make sure that we're giving the same messages at home and at school about not sharing things about other people that are really just shared to harm.
And then another, as a follow-up to another piece of that question before, is what recourses, and Meredith, I'm coming back to your question, it's just on a different topic, but what recourses would a student or family have if they feel like the report was dismissed, or if they're unhappy with the consequences or the restorative efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's always someone else to go to, right? So starting in that immediate situation, if it happened at the classroom level, starting with the teacher, then talking things through with the assistant principal, talking things through with the principal. And then if you're really feeling like something was harmful, something that was done was harmful, and it was not followed up on appropriately, reaching out to myself, to the superintendent, anyone involved in that DASA process, does help. I think going in with fresh eyes and really trying to listen to both sides, it's very hard when it's your own child. Sometimes it makes more sense when you're listening to it about an incident that doesn't involve your child, but you're the one looking at a child who may be very upset at home, and so you know more than just what the school knows. So being able to share that, and not being afraid to call the next person in line. There's a great tool online for parents that it just has that who to call card. It has all different things around curriculum, around DASA, around you name it, anything within the district. It's a two-sided form that really it helps to guide you kind of how to work your way up the chain based on what the situation is. But they shouldn't be afraid to reach out, because we really all work together on things, and we're all part of the same team. So if I could bring another perspective to the building level after talking to a parent, then that's what we want to be able to do. Or I might know of a different resource for support that someone else might not know about, or the principal might know about something the classroom teacher doesn't know about. So don't be afraid to reach out and ask.
Great. And then there was one other one that I thought was really interesting as well. As a parent, I received the information, the youth risk behavior survey is happening, but there was a sentence that I could access the questions, but no link provided. Are the questions online somewhere, or can parents access the survey?
Yes, the questions are in hard copy in the office of each of the 4 secondary schools. So you can go in and you can sit there and you can read through the questions. And there's also in the letter that you received, I think I just got it today, at the bottom, there's a little slip. So if you chose that you did not want your child to take it, then you could complete that as well. The surveys are slightly different between middle school and high school. So there are some differences in questions just developmentally around what we ask students, those different levels. So we do have the parents who come in and take us up on that. You can't take the survey with you, but you can go in and take it. And it's the same survey that's given in all of the Monroe County schools. And then again, we have the choice to be able to add in some extra questions as well.
Great. Was there, let's see, where does the form live on the website? It's helpful just, here is looking here on the who to call, right? Is this the one that you've done, Jen?
The who to call.
Yeah, no, that's a great resource. And I think for people who are here, we're trying to find ways to share that out more as well, so people can find that and it's more widely disseminated. So thanks, Jen, for that.
Sure. And Shana, do you know where it is on the website itself? It just comes up, as the PDF doc. Like what section on the website is it in?
Let me see how fast I can be.
I tried to find it the other day and it wasn't. I don't know if I ever found it. It was easier to go back to the email you had written with that link in it.
Click on parents and students up in that top bar there. There is I might be able to show you. Hold on. Will it let me do this? So if you just click on parents and students from the main page, and then drag down, it's this communication protocol for questions, concerns, feedback. And then there's just some basic information and numbers, and this is kind of that graphic we were talking about, that whether you're talking about everything from their schedule to extracurriculars to DASA. So again, start with the classroom teacher or wherever the incident might have happened, talk to the building principal, call myself, call the superintendent. Yeah, so that's right there. I know, I do feel like that's kind of a one-stop shop, and people, that should be a button right on the front of the website that people can link to, because it is helpful.
Yeah, I think that's some of the feedback I've at least received, that it would be great to have that in even easier than what is the actual form called, and drilling down, because I think it can be found, but I never got to figure out exactly where it was myself. So I think that's really, really helpful. Let's see. And Tracy was saying that that's the same one she'll be sharing out in e-news tomorrow.
Good.
So that we've been trying to circulate that around so people are aware of that as well. So did anyone have a last question? I know we've gone a little over time, but Shana, this has been very helpful to explain. Were there any other questions? We've had actually quite a few questions in the chat, so it's been very nice. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and for your interest. And I hope if anyone takes anything away, it's that it's really a team approach, and we need all parties involved, and people from the classroom level all the way up to the district level to have these conversations, because they are not clear-cut situations in most cases. And it's really about how we're following up on the situation, regardless of how it came to us. So, so please make sure that if there's things that are out there, or people are sharing things with you as members of the DEI committee, that you encourage them to, whether they find that protocol sheet or not, to call someone at the building and let them know, because I can tell you that the people who are working at the building level with our kids want to make that a safe and affirming environment for them.